Congratulations. If this message reaches you before the breakdown, before the compromise, before the silent surrender you make when no one's looking, if this finds you in the space between where you've been and where you're called to go, then you're right on time. This isn't just a sermon, it's a lifeline. Because before purpose manifests, resistance always rises. Before blessings break through, battles come first. But here's the good news. If this message found you before you quit, then heaven's still betting on you. Your name is still in the mouth of God. You still have time. So don't dismiss this moment. Don't underestimate the reach of grace. It's not over, not yet. Let's talk. Destiny often knocks when your faith is on life support. It doesn't show up when everything is neatly aligned and you're full of confidence. It doesn't always come with trumpets and confirmations. Sometimes destiny taps your shoulder when you're just about ready to give up. It whispers in the quiet place where prayers feel unanswered and energy is depleted. That's the part nobody likes to talk about, the place where the anointing feels distant, where the vision has blurred and hope is hanging on by a thread. But this is precisely the soil where God plants purpose. Not in certainty, but in surrender. When you're on life support, your systems are failing. And in a spiritual sense, that's when you discover what your spirit is really made of. When your plans have collapsed and the applause has stopped, you hear a different sound. It's not external. It's the internal groaning of your soul that says, I'm not done. You feel like your faith is gasping for air, but somehow you still keep breathing. You get out of bed even though depression told you to stay down. You walk into that room even when anxiety told you you'd embarrass yourself. You apply again even when rejection is all you've known. That right there is a kind of faith no sermon can teach and no book can capture. That's life support faith. When you're functioning on fumes, but you haven't flatlined, that's when destiny says, now I can use her. See, if you only answered the call when you felt strong, you wouldn't need faith. But God doesn't always wait until you feel ready. In fact, he often calls you precisely because you're not. Because what he's placed inside of you doesn't require your perfection. It requires your participation. It's not about you being worthy. It's about you being willing. And if you're willing while weary, heaven considers that holy. That moment you said yes with tears still in your eyes. That moment you showed up while feeling unseen, that was you aligning with destiny. Not because it felt good, but because it was good. There's a difference. Feeling good is emotional. Being good is eternal. And God is always working for your good, especially when it doesn't feel like it. If you wait for the day when it all makes sense, you might miss the miracle that happens in the mess. Some of the greatest moves of God are born out of the most broken places. The woman with the issue of blood didn't get her healing because she had strong faith. She got her healing because she had desperate faith. She said, if I could just touch the hem. Not if I could grab his hand. Not if I could have a conversation with Jesus. She just wanted to touch a thread. That's life support faith. That's the faith of someone who says, I don't need the whole garment. Just let me touch the edge. That kind of faith doesn't impress people, but it moves God. Because it's raw, it's real, it's the kind of faith you birth in the valley, not on the mountaintop. It's forged in disappointment, in the quiet moments when you cry out, Lord, are you still with me? And somehow, despite everything, you still believe the answer is yes. That's not weak faith, that's warrior faith. That's the faith that destiny is attracted to. Not the curated kind, but the crying in the car kind. Not the kind that's rehearsed, but the kind that's relentless. That's what makes you dangerous to the enemy. Because even when your faith is fragile, your spirit is still fighting. We have this idea that when we're called, everything should start falling into place. But the truth is, being called usually causes things to fall apart first. Why? Because God has to strip away the things that would sabotage your calling. He has to remove the comforts that could keep you stuck. He has to dismantle the false identities you've built just to survive. That's what happens when destiny knocks. Doesn't just bring opportunity, it demands transformation. And transformation is uncomfortable. It forces you to let go of who you thought you needed to be, to step into who God has always known you are. You might be feeling like everything is breaking around you, but maybe what's actually happening is that your container is cracking because your capacity is growing. When your faith is on life support, you're not dying, you're expanding. It just hurts. Growth always does. Ask the caterpillar. Ask the seed. Ask Jesus in Gethsemane. Sometimes your greatest alignment comes right after your greatest agony. Sometimes resurrection power requires a crucifixion of pride, fear, control, and comfort. And when God allows your strength to run out, it's only because he wants to show you how to lean on his. You can't receive divine power when you're still trying to operate in your own. And this is why it's good news when destiny comes. Knocking during your weakest moment, because it means you're not being called based on your performance. You're being called based on your potential. There's something in you that hasn't died, even if everything else has. There's still a pulse in your purpose, a flicker of light in the darkness, a reason to rise even if you're shaking. That's what God uses. He doesn't need your perfection, just your permission. And if you give him your yes while your hands are trembling, he will meet you with power that surpasses your understanding. Some people wait until they feel holy to move. But if you wait for perfection, you'll delay obedience. And obedience is what unlocks overflow. Don't let your weakness make you miss your window. Sometimes the window opens while you're still broken. Sometimes the door appears while you're still doubting. Sometimes your name gets called while you're still in recovery. That's the kind of God we serve. He doesn't consult your condition to determine your commission. He calls you anyway. And if he calls you, he will carry you. So if this message is reaching you while your faith is barely hanging on, don't let that disqualify you. Let it deepen you. Let it remind you that your humanity is not a hindrance to your divinity. It's the proof that God is still writing your story. You don't have to feel strong to say yes. You don't have to be confident to take the next step. You just have to believe that he who started the work will finish it. Even if the only thing you can offer today is a whisper of belief, a shaky prayer, a tear-soaked amen, that's enough. That's more than enough. Because God has a history of doing the impossible with people who almost gave up, but didn't. And maybe that's you. Maybe you're right there on the edge, worn out, burned out, ready to walk away from the very thing you prayed for. But if this message got to you, oh, that's what he was doing. When God delays something, he's not punishing you. He's preparing you. Because it's one thing to get the promise, and it's another thing to carry the weight of it. A gift without growth can crush you. Favor without formation can destroy you. And some of the very things you're crying out for right now would implode your life if they were given too soon. That's why God holds certain things back, not because you're unworthy, but because he loves you too much to let you walk into something you're not ready to sustain. So the delay becomes a classroom, a place where he teaches you how to trust without clarity, where he strengthens your character while the blessing is still on hold, where he develops your spiritual muscles so that when the door finally opens, you're not just ready, you're refined. The danger is that we mislabel delay as denial. We start to believe lies like God forgot me. I missed my moment. It's never going to happen. But silence is not absence. Delay is not rejection. And just because heaven hasn't moved in the way you expected doesn't mean heaven isn't moving. Sometimes what feels like nothing happening is actually everything being aligned. Behind the scenes, God is orchestrating divine connections, clearing out obstacles, maturing your faith, preparing people you haven't even met yet to help carry your assignment. He's not stalling, he's staging, setting the scene for something so tailor-made that it had to take time. The story of Joseph shows us this. He had a dream at 17, but he didn't walk in it until he was 30. In between the dream and the destiny, there were pits, prisons, betrayals, and delays. And yet each delay developed him. Each setback shaped him. The very things that looked like obstacles were actually the training grounds for leadership. How else would he learn how to navigate famine if he hadn't been through spiritual hunger himself? How else would he lead Egypt if he hadn't learned endurance in a prison cell? The delay wasn't to destroy the dream, it was to deepen the dreamer. The same principle applies to you. God isn't just interested in getting you there. He's interested in who you become on the way. The process is personal. It reveals your resilience. It confronts your motives. It surfaces insecurities you didn't even know were hiding inside you. That's why delay hurts, because it exposes where you are still relying on your own plan instead of surrendering to God's. Delay calls your ego into question. It tests your patience, challenges your identity, and breaks the boxes you've put around what God can do and how fast he should do it. But it also births trust. The kind of trust that says, even if I don't see it yet, I still believe. That kind of trust turns waiting rooms into birthing rooms. And you might not see it, but while you're in delay, something sacred is forming in the unseen. Your roots are going deep, because before you rise, you have to be grounded. Before God elevates you, he hides you, not to punish you, but to protect you. Hiddenness is holy. It's where you learn how to pray without performance, where you discover who you are when no one's clapping, where God becomes your source, not the applause of people or the validation of a platform. If he gave it to you while you were still performing for approval, you think you earned it. But when he gives it after a season of delay, you'll know it was grace. You'll know it was him. And that's the kind of testimony that can't be shaken. Silence says you are in the middle of delay right now, and it feels like God's gone quiet. But silence is where faith matures. When there's no sign, no confirmation, no breakthrough yet, but you still show up, still worship, still trust. That's not weak faith, that's warrior faith, because anyone can praise after the promise is fulfilled. But it takes maturity to praise while the promise is still pending. And it's in that tension between what he said and what you see where endurance is built. Delay doesn't mean you're off track. Sometimes it means you're so close that God's fine-tuning every detail. Imagine asking God for rain and he says yes, but then sends you into a drought. The delay between the yes and the rain teaches you how to dig ditches, how to prepare before you see a cloud. That's what divine development looks like. God saying, you're asking for something big. Now let me teach you how to carry it. It's what happened to David. He was anointed as king, but went back to tending sheep. He fought lions and bears before he ever faced Goliath. That wasn't wasted time. It was preparation. God knew the palace was coming, but David needed the pasture first. Not just to learn how to lead, but to learn how to worship in private, to obey without recognition, to fight when nobody was watching. If David skipped that delay, he wouldn't have had the strength for the crown. That's what you need to understand. The delay is developing your capacity. It's stretching your spirit, enlarging your faith, teaching you how to steward what's coming without sabotaging it. And when the appointed time arrives, and it will, you'll walk into it not as a beginner, but as someone forged in the fire. Someone who doesn't just carry the promise, but embodies the perseverance it took to get there. We often confuse God's silence with indifference, but he is the most intentional when he seems the most invisible. Sometimes the silence is his way of letting your roots take hold, because fruit that's picked too soon spoils quickly. But fruit that's allowed to mature in the right season nourishes more than just you. It feeds generations. That's why the delay isn't just about you, it's about the people attached to your obedience. The lives that will be touched when you finally walk into what God's been forming in secret. And so while it feels personal, it's actually purposeful. Your delay is connected to deliverance for others. You don't know who's watching you wait. You don't know who's drawing strength from your persistence. You don't know who's learning how to believe again because you haven't stopped. The way you steward this delay speaks volumes to heaven. Are you still serving when nothing is shifting? Are you still sowing when the harvest hasn't arrived? Are you still loving when love isn't being returned? Those moments matter more than you think. They are the seeds of supernatural promotion. God is not in a rush. He's in relationship. He doesn't just want to do something for you. He wants to do something in you so that when he finally does it through you, it lasts. That's why he waits, because love is patient. And he loves you enough to prepare you before he positions you. This is not punishment, it's pruning. And while pruning hurts, it also makes room for more fruit, more wisdom, more grace. So don't curse the season you're in. There's more growing under the surface than you can see. Your delay is not wasted time. It's divine strategy. It can be easy to mistake darkness for death. To believe that because everything feels hidden, quiet, or still, that nothing is happening. That you've been forgotten, dismissed, buried beneath the weight of all the things that didn't go right. But what if this darkness isn't your grave? It's your ground. What if what looks like being covered is actually being cultivated? What if this isn't the end of your story, but the beginning of something breaking open beneath the surface? Something holy that only God can see. Right now, you're not buried. You're planted. And there is a radical difference. Burial is final. Planting is intentional. Burial is where something ends. Planting is where something begins. When something is buried, it's meant to decay. But when something is buried, it's meant to grow. And though both processes look the same from the outside, covered in dirt, pressed down, hidden from sight, the purpose behind each is completely different. That's why discernment is so important in this season. Because if you call it burial, you'll give up. But if you recognize it as planting, you'll lean in. You'll wait for the sprouting, not mourn a loss that never happened. The enemy wants you to call it a funeral. God is calling it a future. And when God plants you, he doesn't plant you shallow. He presses you deep into the places where you're stretched, where your comfort is stripped, where you're forced to confront what you really believe. Because growth doesn't happen in the light. It starts in the dark, in the quiet, in the soil that nobody celebrates. That's where your roots take form. That's where the real work happens. Underneath. Unshared. That's the part nobody claps for. The season no one sees. But it's also the season that sustains you. Because what God's growing through you will need roots strong enough to hold up the weight of the harvest. Some of us get discouraged because we've equated visibility with validation. We think that if no one sees us, it must mean we're not valuable. But there are things God does in hiding that are too precious to expose prematurely. You don't put a newborn baby in a crowd. You protect it. You keep it covered until it's strong enough to handle the light. And that's exactly what God is doing with you. He's covering you, not to crush you, but to complete you so you don't collapse when your calling finally comes into the light. You have to understand that seeds don't sprout the moment they're planted. There's a waiting season, a growing season, a period of total invisibility where it feels like nothing is working, but something is working. You just can't see it yet. The soil is doing its job, and even though the seed doesn't look like what it's going to become, its destiny is already in its DNA. It doesn't have to try to be a tree. It just has to survive the soil. And the same is true for you. You don't have to force what God has put in you to flourish. You just have to stay rooted long enough for the breaking to become blooming. There's something powerful about a seed's silence. It doesn't complain. It doesn't cry out for attention. It doesn't compare itself to the seed planted next to it. It just goes to work quietly, persistently. It lets the pressure of the soil activate its purpose, because pressure isn't the enemy, it's the incubator. It forces you to dig deeper, to reach for nutrients you didn't know you had. That financial pressure, it's forcing you to budget with wisdom. That emotional pressure, it's teaching you how to heal instead of hide. That spiritual pressure, it's pushing you to pray from a place of hunger, not habit. And all of it is producing something stronger inside of you than comfort ever could. You might feel surrounded, covered by circumstances you didn't ask for, stuck in a space that feels tight and but just because you feel pressed doesn't mean you're paralyzed. Just because it feels like the end doesn't mean it is. Some of the greatest miracles begin in places of complete stillness, where everything has been stripped away and all that's left is the seed of a promise. And that seed is enough, because once God plants a word in your spirit, it's only a matter of time before it bears fruit, not because of your striving, but because of his sovereignty. Think of Jesus. When he was placed in the tomb, the enemy thought it was burial, final, finished, but heaven knew it was planting. He had to go down before he could rise. That 3-day silence wasn't inactivity, it was preparation. It was the process before the promise. And the same pattern exists in your life. Before God reveals you, he refines you. Before he uses you publicly, he roots you privately. That's not rejection, it's redirection. That's not failure, it's formation. You may be in a dark place, but darkness doesn't scare God. In fact, he does some of his best work there. Creation began in the dark. Miracles were birthed in obscurity. Breakthrough often starts in hiddenness. Don't let this season fool you. Just because it doesn't look like progress doesn't mean it's not purposeful. God is doing more with your unseen season than you can comprehend. And one day, what was growing silently will shout his glory loudly. But here's the thing about seeds. They break before they grow. There's a shattering that happens underground, a splitting that looks like destruction, but is actually the beginning of development. You may feel like things are falling apart, but maybe they're just breaking open. Maybe that heartbreak, that detour, that loss, it wasn't meant to bury you, but to break you in a way that made room for the new. Because a seed can't stay a seed forever. It was never meant to remain whole. It has to die to what it was to become what it's destined to be, and that death is not defeat, it's design. So don't resist the breaking. Don't despise the covering. This is sacred ground. Holy silence. The space between no longer and not yet. And even though you can't see the outcome, God is still the gardener. He knows what he planted in you. He knows how long it needs. He knows the right temperature, the right timing, the right season to call it forth. And when it's time, nothing can stop the sprouting. Not the dirt, not the doubt, not the delay. When God says it's time, what was hidden will be revealed. What was buried will burst forth. What looked like the end will become evidence of his power. And when that moment comes, you'll realize that everything the soil taught you was necessary. You'll carry wisdom you didn't have before. Peace that doesn't come from circumstances, but from confidence in God's character. You'll rise, not in spite of the dirt, but because of it. And the very thing that covered you will become the foundation that supports your next level. There's a difference between being alone and being in isolation. One you choose, the other chooses you. One is peaceful, the other can feel painful. But when God pulls you into isolation, it's not because he's forgotten about you. It's because he's preparing you in a way that requires the absence of distraction. There are certain assignments, certain anointings that cannot be cultivated in crowds. They require solitude, separation, silence, because isolation is not punishment, it's positioning. It's where God clears the room so he can speak to you without interference. Most of us don't ask for isolation. We want connection, affirmation, and the comfort of being surrounded by people. But purpose rarely begins in the presence of people. It begins in the wilderness, in the waiting, in the quiet room where it feels like heaven went still and no one is calling your name. And it's in that space that God starts to pull things out of you. Not the things you show to the world, but the hidden things. The wounds you've ignored, the patterns you've masked, the lies you've believed. He uses isolation like a mirror, not to shame you, but to show you who you really are without the noise. Isolation will test your identity. Because when you're no longer surrounded by validation, you're forced to ask, who am I without the applause? Who am I without the titles? Without the likes, the approval, the schedule, the access? Can I still believe in the call when I feel unseen? Can I still trust his voice when it's the only one I hear? These are the questions that make isolation feel like a wilderness. Not because it's empty, but because it's unfamiliar. And in that unfamiliarity, God teaches you how to recognize him in a new way. Without the filters, without the distractions, without the performance. It was isolation that shaped Moses. He spent 40 years in the desert tending sheep, far away from Pharaoh, far from crowds, far from the life he once knew. And it was there in that silence that God showed up in a burning bush. Not in the palace, not at a banquet, not during battle, but in obscurity. Because when you're isolated, you notice what you would have missed in busyness. You see fire in ordinary places. You hear his voice in unexpected moments. And you start to realize that the wilderness isn't empty. It's full of encounters. They're just quieter. Isolation is also a pruning season. It strips away what's unnecessary so that what's prove you still matter. But movement isn't always progress. Sometimes stillness is obedience. And God will set you down when he wants to teach you that validation doesn't equal value, that motion doesn't equal mission, that you can be in the right place even when it feels like the wrong season. It's in isolation that your prayer life deepens. When there's no one else to call, you call on him. When there's no audience, your worship becomes pure. When there's no schedule to impress, your faith becomes focused. You begin to pray, not for performance, but for presence. You stop chasing results and start chasing relationship. And in that place, intimacy forms. The kind of intimacy that anchors you when the waves come later. Because if you only know God through blessings, you'll question him during battles. But if you meet him in the wilderness, you'll carry him into every room you enter, even the ones where you feel outnumbered. God doesn't waste isolation. Every tear, every prayer, every lonely night, it's all building something. Not just for your next assignment, but for your next level of awareness. You'll come out of this not just with strategy, but with stability. You'll have discernment. You'll have depth. You'll have the kind of authority that only comes from surviving silence. And when you speak, people won't just hear your voice. They'll feel your oil. Because oil is only produced through pressing. And pressing often happens alone. You may feel like God has placed you on pause, but pauses are not always punishments. Sometimes they're protection, because premature exposure can be dangerous. If God gave you the platform before he gave you the character to sustain it, the weight of the blessing would crush you. That's why isolation is not a detour. It's a design. He's not just developing your gifts, he's developing your grit. So when the door is open, you're not just anointed, you're anchored. The enemy wants you to believe that isolation means insignificance, but God often hides what he values most. Seeds are hidden, diamonds are buried, oil is pressed in secret. Jesus was resurrected in a sealed tomb. Just because you're hidden doesn't mean you're forgotten. In fact, it might mean you're being protected for a greater purpose. You're in the workshop of heaven, and every cut, every carve, every chisel is intentional. You're being shaped, not shelved. So let the silence teach you. Let the hiddenness heal you. Let the lack of applause remind you that man didn't call you, so man can't cancel you. This season isn't a step back. It's a setup. God is refining you so when he reveals you, you're not shaken by the spotlight. You've already been with him in the shadows. And there's something about people who've been isolated and still kept their faith. Something about those who were overlooked but not bitter, hidden but still hungry, unseen but still unwavering. There's a misconception that breakthrough is always something external. A job, a relationship, a platform, a miracle that others can witness and validate. But some of the deepest, most authentic breakthroughs happen internally. They don't come with confetti or a crowd. They come in the stillness after you've cried yourself dry. In the moments when no one else sees the cost of your persistence. In the space between the breakdown and the bounce back. It's not always about what you achieve. Sometimes it's about who you become. And if you make it through this season with your heart still soft, your faith still intact, and your hope still alive, that is your breakthrough. The real breakthrough isn't when the situation changes, it's when you do. When you finally stop trying to go back to who you were before the storm. When you let go of the image, the mask, the version of you that was shaped to survive, but never meant to stay. When you stop mourning what no longer fits and start embracing what's being forged in the fire, because there is a version of you being birthed in this season that you've never met before. One that doesn't depend on perfection to feel worthy. One that doesn't apologize for taking up space. One that knows how to praise in pain, how to worship without evidence, how to believe even with broken pieces in hand. You had to go through what you went through to meet that version of yourself. The loss wasn't just about the relationship, the opportunity, the stability. It was about stripping away the scaffolding that held up a version of you that couldn't carry your next level. The frustration wasn't punishment, it was exposure. God had to show you where your foundations were cracked, where your confidence was built on people's opinions, where your peace was tied to outcomes instead of obedience. And when it all crumbled, it felt like failure, but it was freedom. Because now you know what can't go with you. Now you know what has to. Stay behind for you to move forward whole. The old version of you wanted approval. The new version seeks alignment. The old version needed everyone to understand. The new version is content with being misunderstood if it means staying obedient. The old version hustled for worth. The new version rests in identity. That shift, that transformation, that's breakthrough. That's the real miracle. Not that the storm stopped, but that you didn't. That you kept praying when you felt unheard. That you stayed faithful when nothing changed. That you showed up anyway. You became someone in the process. Someone stronger, someone wiser, someone more aligned with heaven's vision than your own. There are seasons in life where God is not trying to change your situation. He's using the situation to change you. And it can feel unfair. You'll watch others bypass the pain you're walking through. You'll wonder why it has to be so hard for you. Why the growth feels like grief. While the lessons are so sharp. But every pressure point is forming you. Every disappointment is chiseling away the parts of you that were surviving but not thriving. And it's hard. It's heavy. But it's holy. Because what God is birthing in you isn't shallow. Is sacred, and sacred things are never made in a rush. You don't come out of this kind of season untouched. You come out marked. You come out different. You come out carrying a depth that can't be taught and a power that can't be faked. You come out with a stillness that doesn't require external confirmation. You come out with a spiritual posture that says, I've seen the bottom and God was there too. And that's the kind of strength that can't be shaken. Not by loss, not by delay, not by rejection. Because once you've made it through the kind of season that almost took you out, your worship changes, your authority deepens, your sensitivity to God's voice sharpens. And suddenly you realize that what was meant to break you actually introduced you to the version of you that was always inside, waiting to rise. This is the version of you that doesn't seek healing just so life feels better, but because healing glorifies God. This is the version that knows joy isn't the absence of sorrow. It's the presence of perspective. This is the version that no longer runs from silence, because you've learned that in silence, God speaks the loudest. This is the version that no longer reacts out of fear, but responds from a place of wisdom. This is the version that no longer begs for open doors, but waits for divine timing. This is the you that hell hoped would never be activated. That's why the warfare increased. That's why the pressure built. Because there was something in you that was about to awaken. And the enemy knew that if you survived this season, you'd become unrecognizable. Not because you added something, but because you let some things go. Fear, shame, guilt, the need to prove, the habit of shrinking, the fear of failure, the fear of success. The old you carried those weights without question, but the version of you that's coming out of this won't walk the same. You've been through too much not to transform. You've cried too many tears not to come out clearer. And this transformation isn't superficial, it's spiritual. It's not just about thinking differently. It's about seeing differently. You no longer see closed doors as rejection. You see them as redirection. You no longer see silence as absence. You see it as sacred. You no longer interpret isolation as punishment. You see it as preparation. You've grown, and growth is the breakthrough that no one can steal. It doesn't fade with time. It doesn't disappear when circumstances shift. It stays with you. It becomes part of your DNA, and it gives you authority to lead others through what you've survived. Some people won't recognize you anymore, and that's okay, because breakthrough often separates before it elevates. You weren't meant to take everyone with you. Some people were assigned to the version of you that no longer exists, and releasing them isn't bitterness, it's boundaries. It's wisdom. It's choosing alignment over attachment. Because the version of you that survived this doesn't need to carry old weight to prove loyalty. You've learned how to love from a distance, how to release without resentment, how to move on without making announcements. That's maturity. That's power. This season was never about breaking you down. It was about breaking you open, breaking the walls around your heart, breaking the cycles that kept you bound, breaking the ceiling you placed over your own potential. It had to happen this way, so you would come out forged, not fragile. It had to be this painful so the transformation would be permanent. Because this next chapter will demand more of you, but it will also give more to you. Peace, clarity, capacity, discernment, these are the fruits of the fight. And they don't show up overnight. They grow through pressure, obedience, and surrender. The version of you that survives this will carry the kind of authority that can't be shaken by temporary storms. You'll walk into rooms differently. You'll pray with a fire that didn't exist before. You'll lead with humility, not because you think less of yourself, but because you've seen what God can do when you stop trying to be in control. And people will look at you and wonder how you stayed standing. They'll ask how you didn't lose your mind, and your answer won't be complicated. It'll be simple. I didn't quit. I wanted to. I thought about it, but I stayed. I obeyed. I grew. And that growth became my breakthrough.